In 1978, 24-year-old Elise Morgan stood in the freezing mud of an Oregon estate liquidation, staring at a piece of machinery that everyone else had already dismissed as scrap. The November rain was coming down in sheets, turning the sprawling grounds of the old timber baron's property into a churned-up swamp of diesel-stained puddles and flattened winter grass. There was no auctioneer here today, no rapid-fire chanting to drive up prices, just a bitter wind and a series of white cardboard tags wired to various pieces of decaying equipment. The local farmers, developers, and heavy machinery dealers milled about in their heavy canvas coats, clutching thermoses of black coffee and laughing at the sheer audacity of the prices the estate liquidator had attached to the rusted junk. They were men who dealt in the new, the shiny, and the immediate. They had no time for the forgotten, and they certainly had no time for a young woman standing alone in the rain, staring at a mountain of oxidized iron. Let me tell you about the world Elise inhabited in those days. It was a time of brutal economic reality in the Pacific Northwest. Interest rates were climbing like a fever, small farms were collapsing under the weight of generational debt, and the local banks were entirely unsympathetic to anyone who did not fit the traditional mold of a commercial agricultural operator. Elise was the sole inheritor of 50 acres of marginal valley land, left to her by her grandfather, Elias. The land was beautiful, heavily wooded with ancient Douglas firs and bordered by a winding creek, but it was not profitable. The soil was asleep, exhausted from decades of aggressive farming before her grandfather had acquired it, and the debt he had been forced to take on during a series of devastating medical emergencies hung over the property like a low, dark storm cloud. The community expected Elise to sell. They expected her to quietly hand the deed over to the developers who were already beginning to pave the fertile valley, turning orchards into subdivisions. Now, let me explain the men who were gathered in that muddy yard. They represented the collective, conventional wisdom of the county. Among them was Mr. Thomas, the estate liquidator and the owner of the largest heavy equipment dealership in 3 counties. He was a man who measured worth entirely by the year of manufacture and the horsepower rating printed on a factory decal. He wore a heavy wool coat and chewed on an unlit cigar, holding court among the local farmers, pointing out which tractors were worth salvaging for parts and which were destined for the scrapyard. When Elise walked past the rows of relatively modern equipment and stopped at the very back of the lot, Mr. Thomas and his acolytes nudged each other and chuckled. She was standing in front of a 1950s Ford tractor that had clearly not been started in a decade. The tires were rotted flat, the steering wheel was cracked, and the engine block was covered in a thick layer of grease and pine needles. But Elise was not looking at the tractor. Her eyes were fixed on the massive, bizarre implement bolted to the rear power takeoff and heavy hydraulic lines. It was covered by a shredded, moss-covered canvas tarp, but the brutal, curved steel blades protruding from the bottom gave away its identity to anyone who knew what to look for. The tag wired to the tractor's rusted steering column read $300. It was a price meant as a joke, a nuisance fee for whoever was foolish enough to haul the heavy, useless iron away. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Have you ever looked at a discarded, rusted ruin and seen not what it was, but what it was designed to do? Elise had exactly $340 in her checking account. It was money meant for winter heating oil and property taxes. It was her survival fund. But as she looked at the hidden implement beneath the tarp, she heard the voice of her grandfather echoing in her memory. Her grandfather, Elias, was not a conventional farmer. He was a master mechanic, a self-taught arborist, and a man who possessed a deep, almost esoteric understanding of the natural world. He had taught Elise that the visible world is only half the story. He taught her that a tree's branches are merely a reflection of the sprawling, hidden architecture of its roots. He taught her to diagnose a failing engine by the rhythm of its vibration, and he taught her that true value is never obvious to a crowd. When he passed away, he did not leave her a fortune in cash. He left her the heavily mortgaged land, a barn full of meticulously organized tools, and a collection of handwritten journals filled with mechanical schematics, soil analyses, and detailed observations on the biology of transplanting living things. It was in one of those cracked leather journals that Elise had first seen a sketch of the machine now sitting before her. It was a commercial tree spade, but it was not just any tree spade. It was a specialized, heavy-duty model manufactured for only a few short years in the early 1960s before the company went bankrupt. It was designed with a unique articulated hydraulic jaw that could plunge deep into the earth, encircle the massive taproot of a mature tree, and lift the entire living structure, soil and all, without causing fatal shock to the organism. Modern equivalents simply did not exist. The industry had shifted toward cutting mature trees down and planting cheap, young saplings in their place. To buy a custom-fabricated machine, capable of doing what this rusted implement could do, would cost upwards of $50,000. No one in that muddy yard knew what it was. To Mr. Thomas and the farmers, it was just a strange, obsolete attachment welded to a dead tractor, a worthless anchor of scrap metal. Elise walked over to Mr. Thomas. The rain dripped from the brim of her hat as she pulled 3 crisp $100 bills from her pocket. The men around Thomas stopped talking, their faces breaking into patronizing smiles. Mr. Thomas looked at the money, then looked at Elise, his cigar rolling to the corner of his mouth. He did not try to hide his amusement. He thought she was a naive, desperate girl trying to buy a tractor to save her failing farm, utterly ignorant of the fact that the Ford's engine was seized solid. "You sure you want to do that, little lady?" Mr. Thomas asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "That old Ford hasn't turned over since the Johnson administration. You're buying 3 tons of a headache. The scrapyard won't even give you $50 for it. You're throwing your money into a deep, dark hole." "I will take it," Elise said, her voice quiet, steady, and devoid of any doubt. The men chuckled openly. Mr. Thomas shook his head, pocketed the $300, and handed her the bill of sale. "All right," he said, "but you have to have it off the property by tomorrow night, or I'm charging you storage fees. And I ain't lending you a winch to move it." They thought they had witnessed a fool parting with her last dollar. They believed they knew exactly what they were seeing in her, a desperate, uneducated girl clinging to a romantic notion of farming with obsolete junk. They were wrong. Then, in the fading light of that freezing November afternoon, began the true test of Elise's resolve. The subsequent 2 decades were a master class in patience, mechanical discipline, and unbreakable will. But the immediate challenge was simply getting the massive, dead machine back to her farm. She spent the rest of her money renting a heavy flatbed trailer and a manual winch. She worked alone in the dark, the freezing rain soaking through her clothes, her hands bleeding and numb as she ratcheted the 3-ton piece of equipment onto the trailer, inch by agonizing inch. The physical labor was staggering, but she did not stop. She could not stop. She was fueled by the secret knowledge locked inside her grandfather's journals. The winter of 1978 was historically brutal. The valley froze solid, and Elise's barn became her entire world. She could not afford to heat the massive wooden structure, so she worked in a heavy insulated coverall, her breath pluming in the freezing air under the harsh glare of a single hanging work light. The tractor itself was indeed useless, its engine block hopelessly cracked by frozen coolant years ago. But Elise did not care about the tractor. It was merely the carrier. She meticulously unbolted the massive tree spade from the rear of the Ford, suspending it from the barn's heavy timber rafters with thick chains. For 4 months, she dismantled the implement piece by piece. She learned the intimate language of high-pressure hydraulics. She soaked rusted valves in vats of kerosene for weeks until they finally broke free. She honed the inner walls of the massive hydraulic cylinders by hand, removing decades of pitted rust to ensure the new rubber seals would hold the immense pressure required to slice through heavy earth. She spent her evenings sitting by her small wood stove, poring over her grandfather's notes on fluid dynamics and mechanical leverage, matching his theoretical sketches to the heavy iron parts spread across her kitchen table. The community continued to whisper. The neighbors who drove past her farm saw the lights burning in the barn at 3 in the morning. They saw her walking to the local hardware store, her hands permanently stained black with grease, buying obscure brass fittings and lengths of high-pressure hose. The consensus was unanimous. Elise Morgan's granddaughter had lost her mind. She was sinking into poverty, ignoring her fields, and pouring her time into a rusted piece of junk while the bank prepared to foreclose on her land. There was a moment, late in February, when the sheer weight of her isolation nearly broke her. The bank had sent a final notice of intent to foreclose. The debt was a living, breathing monster in the room with her. She was trying to reassemble the main directional control valve of the spade, a complex labyrinth of springs and spools, and she dropped a microscopic check ball into the deep shadows of the dirt floor. She fell to her knees in the freezing dirt, frantically sifting through the dust, her tears mixing with the grease on her face. She was exhausted, starving, and terrified. She thought of Mr. Thomas's laughter. She thought of the developers waiting to pave her grandfather's soil. But as she sifted through the dirt, her fingers brushed against the solid buried root of an old oak tree that grew just outside the barn. She stopped. She felt the incredible, immovable strength of that hidden wood. She remembered her grandfather's words. The strength of the tree is not in the branches that dance in the wind, it is in the roots that hold fast in the dark. She found the tiny steel ball. She wiped her face, stood back up, and finished rebuilding the valve. By late April, the restoration was complete. She had spent an agonizing amount of time retrofitting the implement to attach to her grandfather's working, albeit ancient, flatbed truck, creating a mobile, self-contained transplanting unit powered by an auxiliary diesel engine she had salvaged from a wrecked generator. The machine was no longer a rusted lump of scrap. It was a terrifyingly beautiful piece of industrial engineering, painted in a tough, rust-resistant black enamel, its hydraulic lines cleanly routed, its massive curved blades sharpened to a gleaming edge. Now came the hardest part, proving its worth. The concept of large-scale, mature tree transplanting was virtually unknown in the region. Developers simply clear-cut land. Wealthy homeowners assumed that if a large tree was in the way of a new driveway, it had to be destroyed. Elise began driving to construction sites, golf courses, and wealthy estates, offering a service they did not know they needed. She was met with slammed doors, skeptical stares, and outright dismissal. She was a young woman in a male-dominated world, peddling a service that sounded impossible. Her breakthrough came in early June. A prestigious, fiercely exclusive country club was expanding its clubhouse. Standing directly in the path of the new foundation was a magnificent 100-year-old copper beech tree. The club's board of directors was deeply divided. Half wanted to bulldoze it to stay on schedule, while the other half, including the club's wealthy president, were heartbroken at the thought of losing the historic tree. Elise walked into the construction trailer uninvited, wearing her work boots and carrying a portfolio of her grandfather's detailed root structure sketches. She did not boast. She spoke quietly, stating facts. She explained the exact diameter of the root ball required to keep the tree alive. She explained the hydraulic pressure her machine could exert. She offered them a guarantee. She would move the tree to the edge of the 18th green, and if it died within a year, she would pay for its removal and refund their money. If it lived, they would pay her $5,000. The construction foreman laughed, but the club president, desperate for a solution, agreed. The morning of the move, a crowd gathered. The skepticism was palpable. The foreman stood with his arms crossed, waiting for her to fail. Elise backed her custom flatbed up to the massive copper beach. She engaged the auxiliary engine. The deep, rhythmic thrum of the diesel filled the air. She stepped to the hydraulic control bank. This was the moment of truth. If her hand-honed cylinders failed, if the old steel cracked under the immense pressure, she would be ruined. She pulled the first lever. The massive steel blades descended. They sliced into the hard, compacted earth with a terrifying, smooth power. The crowd fell silent as the 4 curved spades locked together deep underground, perfectly encapsulating the massive root system, just as her grandfather's journals had predicted. Elise pulled the main lifting lever. The engine bogged down, blowing a plume of black smoke into the sky. The flatbed truck groaned, its suspension compressing under the incredible weight. And then, with a deep, echoing sound of tearing earth, the massive copper beach rose into the air. It was a staggering sight, a 100-year-old giant, suspended perfectly in the steel jaws of the machine, its root ball a perfect, intact sphere of earth. Elise drove the truck at a crawl across the fairway, the great tree balancing upright, and gently lowered it into the pre-dug hole at the 18th green. She released the blades, packed the soil, and shut down the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. The foreman stared, his mouth slightly open. The club president walked over, placed a hand on the rough bark of the transplanted tree, and then looked at Elise with a mixture of awe and profound respect. The tree had not lost a single leaf. That single job changed everything. Word of the miracle machine spread through the wealthy enclaves and development circles of the Pacific Northwest like wildfire. Suddenly, Elise was not a nuisance. She was a savior. Architects began redesigning site plans knowing they could save heritage trees. Municipalities hired her to move ancient oaks out of the path of new highways. Nurseries contracted her to transplant massive, mature pines for wealthy clients who wanted instant, decades-old landscaping. The subsequent years were a blur of relentless, profitable labor. Elise held a total monopoly. No one else had the machine, and more importantly, no one else had the deep, esoteric knowledge of soil biology and root architecture required to ensure the trees survived the shock of the move. She worked with the quiet discipline of a monk. She paid off the mortgage on her grandfather's farm in less than 2 years. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, she began buying the adjoining parcels of land, saving them from the encroaching subdivisions, expanding her sanctuary of forests and fields. The rusted attachments she had bought for $300 became the engine of an empire. Because the original manufacturer had long since vanished, and because environmental regulations regarding the preservation of heritage trees became increasingly strict, the machine itself became an object of legend. Equipment appraisers who eventually examined it, noting its flawless restoration and the sheer volume of high-margin business it generated, valued the implement alone at between $150,000 and $250,000. It was worth vastly more than the 50 acres of land she had originally inherited. But the true catharsis, the moment the circle finally closed, did not happen in a bank vault or on a balance sheet. It happened nearly 20 years after that freezing day in the mud. Mr. Thomas had grown older, heavier, and immensely wealthy. He had transitioned from selling heavy equipment to commercial real estate development. He was building a massive, luxury shopping plaza on the edge of the city. The project was millions of dollars over budget and months behind schedule, stalled by a sudden injunction from the city council. A massive, historically protected Oregon white oak sat directly in the center of what was supposed to be the main entrance. The city refused to let him cut it down. His only option was to move it, and there was only one person in the state capable of moving a tree of that magnitude. Thomas had to swallow his pride and call Elise Morgan's company. When Elise arrived at the construction site, she was no longer the desperate 24-year-old girl in the rain. She was a woman in her mid-40s, deeply tanned, her hands scarred and strong, radiating the quiet, immovable authority of someone who has mastered their craft. She drove the massive, customized transplanting rig onto the site herself. Thomas was waiting near the oak tree. He looked stressed, his face red, chewing on the same style of unlit cigar. He watched as Elise stepped down from the cab and walked over to inspect the soil around the base of the tree. He recognized her immediately, though the years had transformed them both. He walked up to her, his eyes darting over the massive, flawlessly maintained black machinery idling behind her. He looked closely at the steel frame, at the heavy hydraulic cylinders, and then his eyes widened as he spotted a small, original brass manufacturer's plate riveted to the main housing. It was the same plate that had been covered in moss and grease 2 decades ago. Thomas looked from the brass plate to Elise, the realization hitting him with the physical force of a blow. "That's it, isn't it?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper, the arrogant bluster of his youth entirely gone. "That's the implement that was bolted to the back of that dead Ford. The one I sold you for $300. Elise looked at him. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply stated the truth. "Yes, Mr. Thomas," she said. "It is." Thomas took off his hard hat and wiped a hand across his sweating forehead. He looked at the magnificent machine, then at the massive oak tree it was about to easily lift, and finally back at Elise. All the years of conventional wisdom, all his arrogant certainty about the value of things, crumbled in that single moment. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice thick with genuine bewilderment and a deep, humbling regret. "We all looked at it. We all thought it was junk. How did you know what was under that tarp?" Elise reached out and patted the heavy steel flank of the machine. "My grandfather taught me that the most valuable things are rarely visible on the surface," she said quietly. "You all looked at a dead engine and saw a failure. I looked at the steel in the dirt, and I saw what it was built to save. You sold me the scrap, Mr. Thomas. I just kept the purpose." Thomas stood in silence for a long time. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. It was not a business handshake. It was a surrender. It was the profound acknowledgement of a man who realized he had been entirely, historically wrong. "I was a fool, Miss Morgan," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of his admission. "I apologize for laughing at you that day. You saw what none of us could see." Elise shook his hand firmly. "The machine is ready," she said, turning back to the work. "Let's move your tree." The narrative of Elise Morgan did not end with that victory. It expanded, growing deep and wide like the roots of the ancient trees she saved. Today, the valley has changed. The subdivisions have crept closer, the roads are wider, and the pace of the world is faster and louder than ever before. But if you drive down a certain winding county road, you will eventually come to a massive tract of pristine, untouched forest and fertile farmland. It is hundreds of acres of preserved history, owned free and clear, without a single cent of debt attached to its name. Elise is an elder now, a woman whose white hair and deeply lined face speak of a lifetime spent in service to the soil. She no longer operates the heavy machinery herself. She has a crew of dedicated operators who revere her. But on quiet afternoons, she can be found in the massive, well-lit workshop on the property. She sits at a heavy wooden workbench, a cracked leather journal open before her, teaching her teenage grandson how to rebuild a hydraulic directional valve. She teaches him not just the mechanics of fluid pressure, but the philosophy of patience. She teaches him how to diagnose a problem by sound and feel. She shows him the original brass plate on the old machine, reminding him that conventional wisdom is often just collective blindness. Let me leave you with this final thought. The world is full of crowds standing in the mud, eager to laugh at what they do not understand. They will tell you that the old ways are dead, that patience is a fool's errand, and that true value is only found in what is new, fast, and easy. The men in that yard told Elise that the iron was scrap, that the farm was lost, and that the earth was just dirt to be paved over. They were wrong. The dealer laughed and told her she was buying a worthless burden. She kept the burden, she learned its secret, and the land remembered her labor. True wealth is not found in the quick sale or the easy profit. It is forged in the quiet, lonely hours of disciplined work, guided by the deep, ancestral knowledge that the most powerful forces in this world, whether they be the roots of a 100-year-old oak or the unbreakable will of a patient mind, do their most important work entirely unseen in the dark.